They expected you to react immediately, to defend yourself, explain yourself, or correct the moment, because that's who you've always been to them. Predictable, readable, and emotionally available on demand. They knew exactly which words would get a response, exactly which tone would trigger you, exactly how far they could go. And without realizing it, they built a version of you in their mind, a version they could control, not directly or intentionally, but through patterns, because patterns create certainty, and certainty creates control. So every time you reacted the same way, you reinforced that version. Every explanation, every emotional response, every attempt to be understood, it all made you easier to predict. And the easier you are to predict, the easier you are to manage. But something changed, not in a way they could point to or immediately understand. You didn't make an announcement. You didn't set a boundary out loud. You didn't even explain what you were doing differently. You just stopped. Stopped reacting the same way. Stopped filling the silence. Stopped rushing to fix how they saw you. And that's where everything begins. Because the moment you break a pattern, you remove the certainty that pattern created. And when certainty disappears, the mind doesn't stay calm. It starts searching. At first it's small. They replay the interaction in their head, trying to understand why it felt different, why you didn't respond the way you always do. But they brush it off. Maybe you were tired, maybe it didn't mean anything. But then it happens again, another moment where you should have reacted but didn't. And now it's harder to ignore. Because patterns don't just disappear randomly. Something caused it, something changed, and they can't identify what. That's when the questions start. Why didn't they say anything? Why didn't they defend themselves? Why didn't they react? And the more they think about it, the more uncomfortable it becomes, because they're used to knowing where they stand with you. But now, that clarity is gone. And in its place there's uncertainty, and uncertainty creates tension. Not loud tension, but a quiet, persistent pressure. The kind that sits in the back of your mind that you can't fully ignore. The human mind is wired to resolve patterns, to complete what feels unfinished. And you just became a question. Now they start paying closer attention, watching your tone, your timing, your responses, looking for any sign that explains what's happening. But there's nothing clear. No emotional spike, no defensive energy, just calm. And calm feels unnatural where there used to be reaction. When someone expects emotion and gets neutrality instead, it creates a gap the mind immediately tries to fill, so they start interpreting. Maybe you're upset, pulling away, or lost interest. The more they try to define it, the less certain they feel. That's when curiosity shifts from casual to focused. They start replaying conversations and analyzing your behavior for patterns that no longer exist. They're becoming more aware of you, not because you demanded attention, but because you removed predictability. And unpredictability holds attention, so they test it, a small comment, a subtle push, something designed instinctively to restore the pattern and bring you back to something familiar. But you don't react. And that's when the shift deepens, because now it's not just different, it's consistent. Now they have to accept that something changed. That realization creates a new kind of tension, because the version of you they understood is gone. That's when the dynamic begins to shift. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably, they start adjusting in small ways. They become more careful with what they say, more attentive to your responses, because now they're not sure how you'll react. That's influence, not forced or demanded, but real. Influence is about affecting how they think before they act. You didn't tell them to change, you didn't explain anything, you just changed your pattern, and that forced them to reconsider theirs. Real power comes from changing the dynamic without announcing it. When you announce it, people resist, but when they feel it, they adapt. That adaptation is happening now. They're watching you more closely, listening more carefully, trying to understand what you're thinking. But you're not giving them clear answers, and without clear answers, their mind doesn't stop. It keeps searching. The longer it goes unresolved, the more attention it demands. That's when your presence changes, not in how you act, but in how you're perceived. You're no longer just someone they interact with. You become someone they think about, analyze, and try to understand. And that shift changes everything, because attention is where influence begins, and influence is what changes behavior. Now they're anticipating you, thinking ahead, trying to predict what you might do next. But there's nothing to base that prediction on. Uncertainty creates hesitation. They pause before speaking, before acting, before pushing boundaries. They become more careful and controlled. But here's where it gets deeper. That carefulness turns inward. They start questioning themselves and how they've treated you. Without your usual reactions, they don't have feedback or reassurance. So they start filling that silence themselves, and it isn't always comfortable. When people reflect without guidance, they imagine the worst. And that imagination starts to affect how they feel about themselves. That's where emotional investment begins. Not when you chase or explain, but when they start thinking without being told what to think. The more they think, the more involved they become. The more they feel, the harder it becomes to stay neutral. That's the shift. Subtle at first, but powerful over time. You change the environment they respond to, and their behavior naturally adjusts. This is where most people break. The silence feels uncomfortable, and there's an urge to explain, to restore the old pattern. But if you go back, everything resets. The tension disappears, the curiosity fades, and the dynamic goes back to being manageable and controlled. The real shift isn't just stopping once, it's staying consistent, even when it feels like nothing is happening. Because something is happening. It's happening in their mind, in their perception, in how they think about you. That's where the real change begins. Not in what you say, but in what they start to feel. And the moment that feeling deepens, that's when things start to escalate.
Once that feeling deepens, it doesn't stay controlled. It starts to expand. Because what began as a small shift now becomes something they can't ignore. That quiet tension in the background starts moving to the front of their mind. And now, they're not just noticing you, they're thinking about you. More often than they want to admit, more intensely than they expected, because something about you no longer feels settled, and the human mind struggles with anything unresolved. So they go back to the last moment, the one where you didn't react. They replay it again, looking for something they missed. Some signal, some emotion, some hidden meaning. But the more they search, the less they find, and that's what makes it worse. Because when there's nothing clear to hold on to, the mind creates its own version, and that version is rarely calm. It starts with small assumptions. Maybe you were upset. Maybe you were distant. Maybe you were thinking something you didn't say. But those assumptions don't stay small. They evolve. They stack. They expand into possibilities. And those possibilities start to feel real. Now, they're not just remembering what happened. They're imagining what it meant. And imagination, without confirmation, creates emotional instability. Because now they don't just feel uncertain, they feel exposed, like something shifted, and they weren't prepared for it. That's when behavior starts to change more visibly. They begin to reach out differently, not directly asking what happened, but trying to reconnect the old dynamic. A message, a comment, a subtle attempt to pull you back into familiarity. But when your response stays the same, calm, measured, minimal, that attempt doesn't resolve anything. It amplifies it, because now they're trying, and it's not working. And when effort doesn't produce clarity, it produces frustration. Not loud frustration, but internal, the kind that builds quietly. Why are they like this? Why aren't they reacting? Why does this feel different? And that internal questioning starts to turn into pressure. Because they're used to influencing your reactions, used to knowing what to say. But now, none of those patterns work. And when patterns stop working, people don't feel neutral. They feel out of control. That's when the emotional shift happens, from curiosity to investment. Because now, they need to understand, not casually, but urgently, and urgency changes behavior. They start watching you more closely, paying attention to details they used to ignore. Your tone, your timing, your level of engagement, trying to decode something that used to be obvious, but isn't anymore. And the more they focus, the more meaning they assign. A short reply feels intentional. A delay feels calculated. Even your silence feels like a message. Because when clarity disappears, everything starts to feel significant. And that significance keeps them thinking, keeps them engaged, keeps them coming back to the same question. What changed? But here's the part they don't realize. The question isn't what changed. The question is why it affects them so much now. Because before, your reactions gave them stability. They knew what to expect. They knew where they stood. They knew how to navigate you. But now, that stability is gone. And without it, they feel something unfamiliar. They feel uncertain. And uncertainty doesn't stay passive. It demands resolution, so they try again. Another attempt to trigger a reaction, maybe stronger this time, maybe more direct, maybe pushing a little further than before, just to see if they can break through. But you don't. You stay the same. And that consistency is what makes everything escalate. Because now, they can't blame the moment. They can't dismiss it as temporary. They have to accept that this is who you are now. And that realization creates a deeper kind of tension. Because if this is who you are now, then everything they thought they understood about you needs to be reevaluated. And reevaluation takes effort. It takes attention. It takes emotional energy, which means they're investing more into understanding you than they ever did before, without you asking for it, without you demanding it, without you even acknowledging it. That's the shift. You didn't pull them in. You removed the pattern that kept them comfortable, and now they're moving towards you, trying to restore that comfort. But every attempt keeps them more engaged, because it never fully resolves an unresolved attention. Is what turns into focus. Focus turns into thought. Thought turns into emotion. And emotion is what creates attachment. Now, they're not just interacting with you, they're thinking about you when you're not there, replaying conversations, reconsidering moments, trying to understand your mindset, trying to predict your next move, but they can't. And that inability keeps them mentally connected, because the mind doesn't let go of what it can't solve. It holds on to it, returns to it, tries again, over and over, and every time it tries. The emotional investment increases, because effort creates attachment. The more they think, the more they feel. The more they feel, the more they need clarity. But clarity never comes, because you're not feeding the old pattern. You're not reacting, not explaining, not filling the space. You're allowing it to exist, and that space becomes theirs to deal with. And most people aren't comfortable dealing with their own thoughts, especially when those thoughts start turning inward. Did I push too far? Did I misread them? Did I lose something here? And those questions create a new kind of awareness. Not about you, but about their own behavior. Because now, they're not just analyzing you, they're analyzing themselves. And self-awareness, especially when it's uninvited, creates emotional intensity because it forces reflection. And reflection, without reassurance, feels uncomfortable. So they try to resolve it again. Maybe softer this time, maybe more careful, trying to reconnect, trying to feel that old certainty, but it's not there. And the absence of that certainty keeps the tension alive, keeps the attention active, keeps the emotional loop running, until eventually something shifts again. Not in you, but in them. They stop trying to control the interaction and start trying to understand it. They stop expecting you to react and start observing how you move. They stop assuming and start paying attention. And that's when the dynamic fully changes. Because now, you're not reacting to them. They're adjusting to you. Not consciously, not deliberately, but naturally. Because when someone can't predict you, they adapt to you. They become more aware, more present, more invested. And all of that happened without force, without confrontation, without explanation, just from a shift in how you respond. And the more consistent that shift becomes, the stronger the effect. Because consistency builds identity, not just how you see yourself, but how others experience you. And once that identity becomes clear, not through words, but through repeated behavior. It doesn't need to be explained, it's understood. And when it's understood, it's respected. Not because you demanded it, but because you embodied it. And that's the real power. Not in controlling someone else, but in no longer being controlled by expectation. Because once you remove that expectation, you remove the need to react. And when you remove the need to react, you gain the ability to choose when to engage, how to respond, whether to respond at all. And that choice is what creates presence. Calm, controlled, deliberate presence. The kind that doesn't need to prove anything, doesn't need to explain anything, doesn't need to react to everything, because it knows that not every moment requires a response. And that understanding is what separates reaction from control. Because reaction is automatic, but control is chosen. And the moment you start choosing, instead of reacting, everything changes, not just in how people see you, but in how they feel around you. Because when someone feels like they can't fully read you, they don't disengage, they lean in, trying to understand, trying to connect, trying to figure out what's happening beneath the surface. And that effort, that attention, that emotional investment, that's what creates impact. Not loud, not obvious, not forced, but real. because people don't stay attached to what's predictable. They stay attached to what they can't fully understand. And the moment you become that, not by trying, but by changing how you respond, you shift the entire dynamic. And once that shift happens, it doesn't go back easily, because now they've felt the difference. They've gone through the process of trying to understand you, and that experience stays with them, even if they don't fully realize it. And that's why this works. Not as a tactic, but as a shift in behavior. A shift that changes how people think, how they feel, how they respond, all without you forcing anything, just by stepping out of the pattern and staying there. And if you've started to notice people reacting differently, thinking more, questioning more, when you stop reacting the way you used to, then you're already seeing this in real time. But this is just one layer, because there's a deeper level to this, where it's not just about being unreadable. It's about becoming someone people feel, even when you're not speaking. And if you want to understand how to reach that level and apply it naturally in real situations, make sure you subscribe, because once you learn how to hold that presence consistently, you don't just change interactions, you change how people experience you entirely.